skill, challenge different skill sets. Like a test of skill in video games does not necessarily need to be about combat. As a matter of fact, like the Souls games actually don't test you on combat all that much. The older games tested you more on things like your perception, how good at you were you at paying attention to things that were around you. I'll give you a great example of like testing different skill sets for players. So I'm a really big fan of this YouTuber called Mojave D.
Howdy, Mojave D here. I'm doing well. I hope you are doing well. Welcome to another episode of LA Noire, where we just got promoted. We got promoted to homicide.
Who's this 72-year-old man who is not that familiar with video games, but he's been getting into games such as Red Dead and God of War, and he's just really fun to listen to, and he's got like a really great outlook on games that I quite love, even though he hasn't played that many. And so sometimes you can see that he can struggle with video games that are very intensive with combat or shooting. But very recently he started playing LA Noire, and that's a game that revolves around you paying attention to social cues and things like that. And he, despite the guy who's not that familiar with video games, kicks ass at that game to the point where like he did way better than I did whenever I was playing it on my first playthrough. Like on his most recent episode, like he got every answer right on the case. So yeah, it's interesting to challenge different skill sets in video games. That's why so many video games back in the day used to have like mini game sections where it would be to break up the pace. They'd have you play a part of the game that's completely different from the rest of it. Speaking of, I was talking earlier about different bosses could and what the Souls community could learn from like having a different variety of bosses. Okay, I want to hammer this into players' heads that the one-on-one duel kind of bosses where the boss is the same size as the player and has a similar moveset or their own moveset to the player isn't always the best boss like design ever. So yeah, don't get me wrong, I love bosses like that, such as Virgil or Hercules from God of War 3, but it's not automatically the best way to do a boss. If you were to hold like gun to my head, what's the best franchise? What's the best franchise with the best selection of bosses? Without question, I would say it's Kingdom Hearts. Because that Kingdom Hearts, as a franchise, probably has the best collection of the various different ways that you can do bosses. It has those really cool one-on-one duels that you have with like the members of Organization 13. It's got those interesting like mechanical bosses that's allow you to like break an enemy's defense and like hit a weak points or something like that, kind of like a Zelda game. And then it also has like gigantic bosses where you just pump a whole bunch of damage into them. Just like a nice variety of bosses is good, is healthy for a game. You don't need to just keep on copy pasting the whole one type. These games, particularly the Souls franchise, don't need to keep on going back to the well of one-on-one boss fights. And don't get me wrong, I like those boss fights. They're fun, but you kind of get bored of fighting them for over a decade. You know what I mean? I've fought loads and loads of bosses like Artorias in that franchise now, but I haven't fought that many bosses like the Dragon God, for example, even though that's kind of a hated one. If you want a really good, like, example of boss design and how to do it, weirdly enough, look to MMOs. Because MMOs have been going for so long, they kind of have to keep on coming up with interesting ways to do boss design mechanics. And whilst, yes, I think it's got a good number of combinations. Take, for instance, WoW, for example. It's got a wide variety of bosses that are just big sponges that you can pump damage into. But it also has, like, really mechanically driven bosses. Especially as the game got older, because they knew, like, okay, if the boss is just standing and hitting every single time, the player's gonna get bored, so you gotta do different things. I remember there was one boss, like pretty early on in WoW, where it was a giant ball of slime. You can't do damage to this boss. Instead, what you need to do is that you try to freeze it. So you can only hit it with ice-based weapons and attacks and spells. And if you hit this boss with enough frost damage, then it turns into solid ice. Then your raid can shatter it. Then it splits off into a whole bunch of different pieces that try and form back together. And while all the pieces are split apart, then you can do damage to those pieces. And it's a big race to destroy all the pieces before they form back into the big slime boss fight. And I'm not even saying that that's the best boss in WoW ever, but it's just sort of like, it's a little more interesting than just like standing and hitting. And it's an example of like, you can do a bunch of cool and creative things with bosses with a pretty limited moveset. And the Souls games have a much more varied moveset than what WoW has. So what's stopping them from doing interesting things again with it?